to Solosaurus, a podcast about one-player board and card games. My name is Brandon Waite.
And my name is Carter Mackey.
And this is episode 31, where we're talking about the game of managing your emotions and building your identity, Cerebria, the Inside World. But first, as we always do, we will start with the news. Our first bit of news this week is about a little game that's coming to Kickstarter from Caravelle Games called Twisty Little Passages. And this looks pretty cool because this is basically a book of solo dungeon crawl puzzles that span a series of maps that's broken into story chapters. And so you're going to be trying to survive each area in this book by optimizing your equipment collection and your items and deciding when to fight monsters and when not to, all while trying to prepare to beat the level boss. This seems pretty cool to me just because it's a book of dungeons, basically. Apparently, these are going to be laminated pages that you're going to use dry erase markers on to mark your movement. I really like the idea of this. It sounds like it could be pretty low cost and a nice way to solo dungeon crawl if you want to do that without managing a whole lot of cards and tokens and all kinds of stuff. Just seems pretty cool to me.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested to see what it's like.
Yeah, so if you're interested in that, check it out from Caravelle Games, coming to Kickstarter on May 14th. Our second bit of news is that Bloodborne the board game from CMON is now on Kickstarter. We mentioned this a few episodes back, and I mentioned it in my most anticipated games list for this year because I love the Bloodborne IP very much. And I know that even though I love the IP, I need to be a little bit suspicious of any project. Maybe especially projects from CMON.
Yeah.
But this one actually looks really cool. It is basically a solo-friendly, meaning like a true solo-friendly dungeon crawl adventure type experience. And so what I mean by that is normally when you play dungeon crawl, you have to play more than one character in order to get the full experience. This one you can just go with one lone hunter into the city of Yharnam and hunt down some beasts and level up your character over the course of a campaign. But the campaign is short. It's only, 3 play sessions long. Each play session looks like it might happen in an hour or less. I just really like the idea of all of that.
Yeah, it definitely has a lot of promising things for solo, because I feel like being able to just manage one character and that be a satisfying experience is a very appealing idea.
Yeah, it certainly is for me. And if you're at all interested in the IP, you should definitely check this out. And maybe even if you aren't. I mean, the miniatures and the monsters and the world all look really cool. So if you're at all interested in a true solo dungeon crawl / adventure style game, check out Bloodborne the board game on Kickstarter right now. Our last bit of news for this week is that Fantasy Flight has announced the first expansions for Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. And when they announced them in true Fantasy Flight fashion, the game wasn't even out yet. So there you go, folks. In case any part of you was wondering if there would be expansions for a Fantasy Flight game, they've got them.
Right, yeah, I know. Not a huge surprise.
No, not really at all. Although I've got to say, we have the Lord of the Rings game on the desk right now as we're recording this. I've already been playing through it a little bit. And from what I understand, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong in this, it sounds like there are 14 chapters in the first campaign in this box. And it sounds like they already have a second campaign that'll be ready for purchase for maybe $4.99 coming Q3 of this year. You don't need any additional figures or anything to play it, just like you can buy sort of DLC chapters for Mansions of Madness. That's going to be a similar distribution method for this. But they will also have available for purchase a villain pack that has 3 different miniatures in it. So if you want to see more different villains show up in your campaigns, then you have that option. I know that Fantasy Flight gets a lot of flack for announcing expansions early, and it is a little bit silly. But this sounds like a pretty cool model for expanding this game. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, and that's a pretty reasonable price for, I feel like, expanding a game if it's, however many hours of content.
Yeah, that's a similar price point to the extra scenarios from Mansions. I'm sure these will be shorter than the base game campaign, but still very cool. So if you're at all interested in Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth, we will have that review coming for you in the very near future. Now you can also know to look forward to the expansions. And that's all we've got for you for the news for this week. So we're just going to move like we always do right into our review, which this week is for Cerebria, the Inside World. Cerebria comes to us from several designers, and I'm going to butcher every last one of their names. Richard Amann, Victor Peter, Frigga Schoberl, Nick Shaw, Istvan Pochi, and David Turchi. That last name will probably stick out to many of you, as he was involved with Anachrony, among other things. This game comes to us from Mind Clash Games in 2018, and Cerebria is a dynamic, team-based, objective-driven area control game where players are going to play as spirits, these powerful entities representing bliss or gloom, and then these opposing forces, the two sides of human nature, are going to struggle to control and shape the inside world, which is the metaphorical representation of an evolving personality. You're basically building a person's emotional identity in this game. So the game is centered around the player-controlled spirits and the emotion cards controlling the different areas of Cerebria, each with their own stats and abilities, and the team that has the most influence on the creation of this personality at the end of the game wins. So that's just the general idea for the game. If you want the TLDR version of that, this is Inside Out, the board game, basically.
Right.
But just in a Euro area control format. And right off the bat, I'm just going to say that is a really awesome theme for a game.
Right. I mean, I've never heard of a theme for a board game that's remotely close to that.
No. And what's even cooler to me is that it's for a Euro game.
Yeah.
I mean, Mind Clash is just killing it with respect to the kinds of themes they're able to put with traditional Euro mechanics. There are so many Euro games that come out every year that have just another trading in the Mediterranean kind of theme pasted onto them. And maybe it does make you feel like a merchant in the Renaissance. And maybe some people really, really want to feel that again. I'm over it, and I'm really excited about the themes that they're putting out.
Right. I would say some of those themes work for me better than others, but I love that all of them are so different and a unique take.
Yeah, absolutely. I did not find the theme for Tricarian that compelling, even though it's a cool idea, doing a magic show, becoming a good performer and magician. But I was excited to try it just because it was something different. And That's what they do really well. And thankfully, this really cool theme is represented very well in the quality of the components in this box. Because, just for starters, the artwork for this game is unbelievable.
Yeah, the artwork is really good. I don't love it just in a personal taste kind of way, but it is really good artwork. No doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Very colorful, vibrant board. It does a good job of representing the different emotions that are in the game, I think, in pretty cool and compelling ways. I don't know. I just love the look of it. When everything is spread out on the table, you've got this big, colorful board that represents the mind, Cerebria, that the different spirits are trying to vie for control in. You've got tokens on the board on these big tarot-sized cards where you're putting down emotions in different areas of the brain, trying to exert your dominance, basically, over this burgeoning person. And everything, once it's out on the table, just looks so inviting. I mean, there's very clearly a lot going on, but it looks beautiful on the table.
Right. And also just the colors for gloom being that like dark blue and then the orange for
bliss.
For bliss, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it all looks great. They do a good job of sort of fading from the blue to the orange as you progress from the gloom side of the board to the bliss side. And there are two different sides to this board because this is a team game. At its heart. So we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But the art conveys all of that for me. And the graphic design, which is just incredibly well done.
Yeah, it's all very thoughtful.
Yeah, and clear and easy to understand, I think, at a glance, what you're looking at. Even though there's a lot of symbology in this game.
Yeah, a whole lot.
Yeah. So it looks fantastic, for sure. The one thing that Carter noticed that I didn't was the size of the board itself.
Yeah, I just don't like games that seem unnecessarily large. I mean, I know there's lots of people who love giant games. They love giant cards because all the cards in this game, well, all the emotion cards, which you're using a lot of, are giant cards. And you need a big board to put all those cards on. And the benefit of that is you have big, beautiful displays of the art. The bad part is you have a giant game that leaves very little room on your table. Like, I have a pretty big table, and I couldn't even put my player mat in front of me with the board in front of me. So it just has to be to the side.
Yeah, it's an incredible table hog. And that's not the sort of thing that I care that much about as long as it fits on my table. But I will say this was definitely pushing the limits of that for me. And it just felt like it didn't really need to be that big.
Right. I guess that's it. Is when a game feels unnecessarily big, like there's that you could shrink it down a little bit or rearrange things, you know? So I don't know. It's a personal preference, but it is a reality.
Yeah, it is definitely a reality. Otherwise, all the components in this game are great. There are these wonderful little gem pieces that represent the sort of energy you're absorbing from the core of the brain over the course of the game that look fantastic. And as you go throughout the game, you're building this identity with different bliss and gloom pieces that look like an obelisk in the center of the board. And that looks stunning.
Right. From all the different colors alternating, that just looks really cool. Did you mention the internal dial like spins around?
Oh, no, I didn't mention
which
that.
I mean, that's a really cool aspect of the game. And just, I don't know. It's a neat design.
Yeah, absolutely a neat design that looks fantastic. So that already has just a huge amount going for it and how it looks. In fact, that's what first sucked me in. The theme and the artwork for this game really drew me in. Plus, Mind Clash Games' reputation as a publisher.
Right.
But then when the game arrived at my house and I started looking through the rule book, I will say a lot of the rules are very well laid out, and I feel like all the information is organized well within them. I also really appreciate that they have a book dedicated just to solo and co-op play. And so you don't have to wonder where in the first rule book you need to look for solo rules. It's in its own little world.
Well, you say that, but it recommends for solo game using the Shaper rules, which is in the back of the regular book.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And it says use the setup with these exceptions, which is in the regular book. And so setting up the solo game the first time was pretty, I feel like, time intensive because I was looking through 3 different places.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And just getting to the point where you can set up the game in the first place is time consuming because it's a big old rule book.
Yes, it is. It is well explained, but it is a giant rule book that uses, they have names and terms for everything. At least for me, without having gameplay to kind of anchor a lot of these terms and words to, it is easy to kind of get lost with what things are talking about. I was like, okay, I read about a rule. I don't really know how it like connects to the bigger picture. And that's just kind of a part of games, but I don't know. I really felt that when reading through this rule book.
I did too. And I think the reason for that for me is that this is a game that's anchored in sort of a real world theme, but also like a fantasized version of it. And so I appreciate when rulebooks try to use thematic language to talk about the mechanics they're trying to teach you. But when I don't understand the different terms that you're using for this world, then it's very hard for me to understand what you're talking about. So just as an example, the main point of this game is to try to have revelations, that you want this person that you're forming basically to have revelations that leads them to develop a personality that's more oriented toward bliss or more oriented toward gloom, depending on which side you're playing. When they start using language like revelations and absorption and cerebria and all of these different terms in the beginning pages of the rulebook, there's not much of an effort made to connect what those things mean in terms of actual mechanical gameplay or components on the board. So I kept flipping back and forth to look at the component list more than I've ever done, I think, to try to figure out what the heck they're talking about. It's probably not a big deal, but for me, it just took a while for me to wrap my head around what the game was trying to do just because of that thematic language.
Right, I agree.
On top of that, though, the game is complex. There's a lot going on, for sure, but I would say that it definitely comes across as more complex when you're reading the rules than it does when you're actually playing the game.
I feel like I kind of implicitly knew that. I don't know why, but that's kind of what I told myself to comfort myself as I was trying to get through the rules, that like, this probably seems way worse than it actually is. As far as like complexity and understanding what's going on. Which
is a good thing on the one hand, because you get into the game and you have that realization like, oh, well, I can do this. You know, this isn't as bad as I thought. The bad part of that, of course, though, is you're intimidated to actually get started, and it takes you a long time to get through the rule book, and I just feel like there's a big barrier to entry for this one. That is made bigger for the solo player. One of the things that I loved about Anachrony so much, and David Turczi, the same designer who did the solo mode for Anachrony, is the guy who's involved with the solo mode for this one. I love the solo mode for that game because it was inventive and it was new and it was fresh, but it had just a very few rules to govern what you did on the Chronobot's turn. This has its own dedicated rulebook that you need to read all of if you're going to understand what you're doing for the solo game, and it's like 12 pages long.
Right, with lots of procedures for how to handle different things.
Yeah, oh man, the procedures and the exceptions and what happens when you get 2 symbols of the same type versus 1 symbol of this type and one of another was just like mind-melting for me.
Yeah, I feel pretty confident that I made a considerable amount of mistakes.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And on the one hand, I think that what he's managed to achieve here with the solo rules is pretty incredible because you're taking a mechanic as dynamic as area control, which really is at its best when there are multiple players at the table. And he does make a very workable solo experience for it. But that just means that there are going to be so many more rules. In order to make that work at all, you have to. I mean, of course Anachrony has fewer rules because worker placement is just as simple as, does the Chronobot block the space or not? Does it gather these resources or not? You know, it feels cool and dynamic to play, but the mechanic itself doesn't need that much work to make it dynamic.
Right.
So, on the one hand, the rules for the solo mode are very interesting and compelling, but man, there's just a lot to overcome there. But overall, I would say the rules are well laid out. There's just a lot to take in. That said, when you get to the play of the play for the game is pretty interesting. It is pretty straightforward area control.
Yes.
In a lot of ways. And so what you're going to be doing on the course of any given turn, at least in the basic game, which is what we'll start with first, is you'll be taking 3 different actions, or I guess I should just say you'll be taking 3 actions. They can be the same or different. And your options are that you can move your spirit around the board, and this is basically like a circular map, and your spirit typically needs to be next to a location in order to do something there. You can invoke, which is where you put down an emotion in an empty slot on the board, and this is basically the main way that you start controlling different areas of Cerebria, what you want to do in order to meet different end-game or end-of-round goals and start to gain dominance over the brain, basically.
Because this all comes down to area control, basically.
Yeah, it's all just really kind of straightforward area control in this respect. Mm-hmm. This is basically you getting units onto the board. And you'll have a chance to sort of upgrade them later and make them stronger over time. But this is just getting those basic things out. And another reason that's helpful for you is that once you start to exert dominance over a certain area, it also makes the actions you can take that are associated with that area a little more efficient, I guess is a good way to say it. So you're definitely incentivized to be putting out these emotions as often as you can over the course of the game. But then you have other things you want to be doing too, of course. You can fortify an area. So, the longer you maintain control of this particular area of Cerebria, you have access to its cool little efficient action bonus, and it helps you toward your goals. Well, you can't always be there to protect the emotions that you put out in the first place. So one of the ways you can shore up your power there without having to put out more emotion cards is to build a fortress. And this is pretty cool because it adds to your influence in that area, and then it also comes into play when it's time to score. It basically gives you extra opportunities to score if you have a fortress in that area.
Right.
Because when you put a fortress down, you're using those little plastic pieces that become part of the obelisk where you'll score at the end of the game. And if you've got a plastic piece there when it's time to score, you can add it to the big monument. Mm-hmm. So that's a little complicated and difficult to understand over audio, but basically fortification helps you in 2 different ways then, controlling and scoring points at the end of the game. And then you can quell, which basically means you can decrease the power of your opponent's emotions. And that's the main sort of simple actions that you can take on the course of your turn in the basic game. Now, as time goes by, you can upgrade those actions and make them stronger and more efficient, which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Actually, there's a real sense of growth during the course of this game. But it does feel to me very straightforward as far as how the area control of this works, in that you're just going and putting down units on the board, strengthening yours, decreasing the power of your enemies, and just trying to keep dominance over as much as you possibly can.
Right. And just as the game goes on, areas become more established. There's obviously kind of like, I feel like battleground areas. And as you try to kind of swing those and not leave your back open, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And that's hard to do because the positioning of these cards is such that some cards are going to be firmly within one area that you're trying to control, and others sort of straddle areas. And so they have the ability to influence maybe two areas at once, but they can be blocked more easily so that their influence doesn't reach one or both of them. So again, confusing to explain over audio, but all that to say, that's a really interesting wrinkle that they introduced into area control. Your unit may not be just in one area, which is, I think, a pretty cool innovation.
Yeah, I think it's cool, like having that. And I mean, there's obviously the main kind of group areas of, the mind that you're controlling. But there's also the controlling these frontier areas between the different main areas. I don't know. It's a lot of little interesting things, and you might have advantage with some things and not in others.
Yeah, and you can't upgrade all of your actions equally over the course of this game. You just probably won't have the time. And so you definitely specialize as you move forward, making one set of actions stronger over another. And if you were playing a multiplayer game, then you could, because you're playing on teams of two, you could make your powers such that they complement your neighbor's powers, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a solo game, you do lose that aspect of it, but I didn't feel like I was missing out on very much. That's sort of the main bunch of things that you do on your turn, but there is one other crucial thing that you do, and that is you have the option to absorb from one of these different pockets of gems that are in the center of the board in this sort of rotating platform. You have the opportunity to draw gems from one of those pools that you're adjacent to, and it basically use that to power your different abilities over the course of the game. So you're going to be wanting to get this willpower, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
It's a resource that helps you, and when you absorb from one of those pockets, each one of those is associated with a different action. So when you absorb from one, you're not only thinking about which one has the amount in it that you might want to get, but also what action can I do on top of that?
Right.
Which is pretty neat because those little wells of willpower rotate at the end of every turn. And that creates a very interesting timing puzzle that is not entirely different from Zolkin, only like a very dumbed down version of it.
Right. It's simplified. It doesn't hurt your brain to like contemplate that timing puzzle.
No, but you do sort of want to position yourself properly so that when you're absorbing from the well that gets you the most power, but also that empties out the well that you want to empty at just the right time and in the right place.
Right.
When you still have control over the end of round goals and you're ready to score them, you don't want to give your opponent another round. And maybe you want it to be adjacent to one of your fortresses so that you can score that. There's a lot of thought that goes into the absorption mechanic, and you get to do that every turn. I really like that. It basically controls the speed of the game.
Yeah, it's just a nice kind of internal clock to keep the game moving along. And I know it has a progression. It's very rewarding when you pull off a really good or just a really well-timed absorption action.
Yeah, in fact, there was one game when I saw 3 goals in a row for the next couple of rounds that I thought that I would have the opportunity to score. And I went ahead and sort of positioned myself well to get those, emptied out these little wells sort of at the same pace, and then scored 3 different rounds in a row. And that way I'm able to get all the points from all 3 of those. It makes you feel clever.
Mm-hmm.
If you can do it well, it makes you feel clever. I suppose the flip side of that is when you don't, you feel like an idiot.
Right, which is more of the camp I fell in on this game.
Well, yeah, sure, and that's the camp I typically fall in. I think I got lucky with lining them up that one time. But it has the opportunities for that, and for me, that's one of the coolest things you can experience in a game. So I really like that mechanic quite a bit. And what's most interesting about it is that absorption is so closely linked to the way that you score in a basic game. So when one of these little wells of willpower gems is emptied, the brain experiences a revelation, and you're going to grow as a person, and another, permanent piece of your identity is going to be formed where you become a person who's more tilted toward gloom or toward bliss in your outlook on life. Thematically, I think that's great. Like you lose the willpower to do anything else in this one area of your life, and then you have a revelation, almost like you have to hit bottom in some respect.
Right.
Or run out of answers or something. And that's really cool thematically. Mechanically, what happens is When one of those wells is emptied, you look at the end of round goals. You look to see if you did better on that goal or if your opponent did. Or if you both met that goal, you can add your own pieces of the identity obelisk thing that you have, these big chunky plastic pieces, to the center of the board. And at the end of the game, how many pieces you have on this monolith is going to tell you how many points you've gotten over the course of the game.
Right.
So if you manage to score both your major goal that you have for that round and your own little personal minor goal that your team has that's hidden from everyone else, then you get to put on a major fragment of the identity, which is this really big chunky piece. It's worth more points. It feels awesome when you manage to achieve your own personal goal and the big public one at the same time.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And then the game's going to end then when one side is run out of fragments and they just cap it off with the cool pointy piece you might have seen of in pictures of this game, that capping fragment. Or if we've run out of goals to go through, that's when the game's going to end. You're going to add up all the points that are represented on this obelisk, and then whoever has the most wins the game. That's very cool to me. I love how all of that works, how you can add in fortresses that are nearby onto the obelisk. If you have a revelation right when you're adjacent to one of your fortresses, I guess. That adds another cool element to the timing puzzle. It all just feels very satisfying to me.
Right. I like how all of it's just tied together in a really cool way. And just, I don't know, it's a way that makes sense to me. And it's just cool. It's just a clever design.
Absolutely. Things get a little crazier when it comes to the advanced game.
Yes.
Like quite a bit crazier.
Okay. So I only played the basic game one time. And I feel like I could have played it several more times before moving on to the advanced game.
I did play it several times before I moved on to the advanced game, and I did find it to be very satisfying every time.
Right. I guess that's part of it, is a lot of times when I've played the basic versions of games, it's like, yeah, I know this is recommended, but I just kind of can't wait to move on. I just consciously decided to move on. I didn't necessarily want to. I just wanted to go ahead. But I know that I could have played the basic version several more times and gotten plenty of satisfaction out of it.
Yeah, which sort of makes it feel like a built-in expansion almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that aspect of this game, but an expansion that's super well integrated into the original vision for this game.
Yeah.
So what the advanced game adds is, first of all, asymmetrical player powers for the different spirits that you're playing, which is already awesome.
Yes.
Because there's a good selection of them in the box. They all feel very different in terms of their different abilities, and not only their special ability that they can pull off, but also how you progress through the growth of their different powers that they take during the course of the game. That's all very cool to me. Adds to the replayability. I really like that a lot. The other things it adds, though, it adds a whole nother action that you can do on your turn, which is empower. And this is pretty neat because, first of all, I should say, when you're playing with different emotions, you actually have different decks of emotion cards that you play with. And the rulebook has this whole list of, if you're playing as the delight spirit, you can play with this emotion deck that has this many happiness cards and this many exuberance cards or whatever. It tells you add 3 of this many, 2 of this many, and you build the deck according to these specifications. And it's sort of tailored toward what your spirit would be most interested in. That's very cool. It also has rules for deck building your own decks.
Yes.
Which I can't imagine ever being interested in because there's so many other options available to you.
There's so many. And I feel like it would be hard to really have a meaningful deck difference than the kind of the recommended ones for the spirits. But I don't know. Maybe so. I'm sure there's people who would play and find that nuance, but yeah, I love that there are the deck lists, though. That's so great. This is a cool aspect there's not just a set thing, but there's this whole other, almost like pre-game, part of it.
What's really interesting is when you add this advanced game, now you have all these different emotions that are in your spirit's deck. That's all very cool. But now you have access to strong emotions on top of that. And that's where this extra action comes in. If you get to a point where you've sort of maxed out your emotions influence on the board on this one particular card, you can upgrade it basically to the strong version of that emotion. And so, excitement might become exuberance. and exuberance has a cooler power associated with it than excitement did. That gives you, extra control over the board or gives you different perks for taking certain actions. And I already like the fact that you get perks associated not only with controlling different areas, but even with just having different emotions down on the board. I thought that was cool. Adding in the strong emotions adds an extra layer to that.
Right, yeah.
So that, for me, is actually kind of a simple upgrade for the advanced version that adds a lot to it, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I mean, I would even say, they give you the option of, we talked about the 4 base actions that you have, that you start off with. You can play around with that whenever you're starting the game. So, I mean, you could have a more upgraded move action or something else like that, or empower, whatever you like. But that means you wouldn't have other actions that you would normally start off with. But it's just to give you that versatility is really cool.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's a very cool addition to this game, and not only because it makes you feel stronger, I think it makes you feel cooler when you can put down a strong emotion or, power up your empower action over some other action like move. Having that freedom is nice, but also it makes other actions more valuable. So for instance, if you can see that the opposing player is getting close to maxing out one of their smaller normal emotions, you might want to go over there and quell it. It makes it a much more compelling to want to go over and quell that thing before they can turn it into a strong emotion. Now, of course, in the solo game, the AI doesn't actually use strong emotions, but that's just gives you an idea of what it might be used for, I guess, if you were playing multiplayer. Overall, though, I'm just very happy with what that adds. The thing that I'm a little less crazy about in the advanced game, and it could just be that I'm not good at it yet, is the intentions. And that's basically like another set of different goals that you can try to go after that are actually printed on your team's little board that can get you a few points here and there. And what's interesting about this is you can win the game by being the first to a certain number of points in the advanced game. Whereas in the basic game, you're just trying to go ahead and, get as many points as you can before the identity is completed. This sort of gives you more of a race element, maybe?
Yeah, I would say so.
The goals feel a little bit smaller and less exciting to me, but they're a more crucial part of the game.
Right, and being able to kind of chain them because you get more points if you can do multiple of them in the same turn.
Yeah, and I can see where a lot of people would like that, and maybe I would too after a few more plays of it, but it didn't grab me right away. That's what I'll say. After the first few games of the advanced game, the intentions didn't seem like a great add-on to me personally.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a lot, I guess, because to me, the other stuff is satisfying enough. And yeah, I mean, if this is a game, which I would say this is common of Mind Clash games, that you're going to be playing these games time and time again and just unlocking more and more layers of depth into it. And so I can see where it really, really caters to that person. But I was very satisfied with all the other complexity in the game instead of having this one little, or not having these little goals that you're trying to do and make these really big pivotal plays.
Yeah, I agree. Some people I think will find that great. Probably most people even.
Yeah,
but
sure.
From my perspective, it just felt like a little, not even tacked on, but just unexciting compared to everything else. So otherwise, though, the advanced game does add quite a lot, including some elements like the different asymmetrical powers that add a lot to the game with very little extra overhead, which I think is very cool.
Yes.
So definitely a cool addition to this game. And that really leaves us with only one more thing to talk about as far as how the play of the game goes, and that is the solo system itself. I really had a hard time imagining how they were going to pull off a compelling solo AI system for an area control game. That is not easily done at all. And I love the Chronobot so much with its mixture of risk management and excitement with the roll of the dice, but also being able to see what's coming next. That when I saw in the rulebook that this is managed by just a deck of cards, I just sort of thought, we're going backwards.
Yeah, it
here.
seems like a step backwards.
But it turns out really not to be, from my perspective. It's a step backwards in terms of how much rules overhead there is.
Yes.
And for me, that is just too much, to be frank. But what he manages to accomplish here with this card system is very cool, because what you're going to be doing is you have this one deck of AI cards, and you're going to, the first card face up, and it's normal sort of up and down orientation. And then you'll flip the card after it upside down. and you'll alternate that way all the way through the deck. And then before you start your turn, you flip up the first card of the deck, and you could see the actions they could possibly take this turn. But you don't know which of those actions it's definitely going to take.
Right.
Only when it's the AI's turn do you flip that second card that sort of matches up with it perfectly. You lay the two side by side, and then suddenly you can see which of those options it's going to choose. And I really like that because it basically does the same thing the Chronobot does, or at least achieves what the Chronobot's able to achieve, but with cards by showing you the options up front, but you don't know fully what it's going to do next. I thought that was a very cool and streamlined way to handle that.
I thought it was a great way to do it, yeah, because it's still that kind of anticipation of like, I don't really know what's coming, but I can see these actions listed out in front of me and kind of happen to be able to anticipate somewhat like you would with most, when playing with other people.
Yeah, I think that's true. It definitely does a good job of replicating that across the table experience.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe less so the across the table experience of this particular game because it has a team orientation typically. Mm-hmm. But I like the way that's handled. The way that you take care of not having a second player on your team is that basically you get to act twice, whereas each of the AI's spirits, which it does have two that move around the board, they'll get to act once per, 4 turns. For instance, you get to act twice per 4 turns. So you have a little bit of limitation in terms of not being able to get around the board as easily as they do, but you do have the ability to take twice as many actions and take more advantage of the different powers that you give yourself over the course of the game. So it all sort of evens out in that respect. I like the way that works for the most part. The problems for me with this solo system are the rules do get in the way quite a bit. I was looking up how to handle different icons that appeared on the cards pretty much constantly while I was playing. Also, the deck element does mean that this can be more swingy because you've just got a randomly shuffled deck of cards. Some games I won handily. Other games I just felt like were punishing because I kept getting these combinations of cards that I felt like were punching down the emotions I just put on the board in a way that I couldn't get ahead. So I found it to be almost equal parts very frustrating and very clever as a way to manage a solo experience for an area control game.
I guess it wasn't swingy for me in the sense that like I lost all of my games. So,
So there's just the one.
It was just one direction.
Okay.
And I think that's somewhat that I'm not great at area control games in general, but I think it was also partially just because like the deck just wasn't having it, And so I'm with you in that it's a good way to handle area control because that is a difficult thing to automate. But it's still kind of fundamentally unpredictable in how those cards are going to line up. And just because I guess I will say I did have some really fortuitous outcomes as far as the cards and getting to accomplish what I wanted. But yeah, sometimes it's just like, well, them's the breaks.
Yeah, that's true. I will say it does probably even out in terms of the amount of lucky breaks that you get.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not within one game.
Right.
But over the course of multiple games. The problem is if they all stack up in your favor or against you in one game, it feels a little bit one-sided in a way that's not so much fun.
Right.
I will say, though, that it did feel, apart from having to look up icons and things in the rules or make sure that I'm not missing exceptions, I do feel like I could get to a point with this game if I played it a few more times where the rules started to become less of an issue for me. I think that's a possibility. However, that being said, I don't think that I would be able to see past the rules in a way that immerses me in the theme here. I enjoyed the solo system that's set out for this game. I think it's very clever. I find it amazing what he's managed to achieve in one deck of cards. It's not altogether different from the solo system in Gaia Project in that way, if you've ever played that. You do get a sense of what's coming at the beginning of your turn, and then you see it completed a little bit later on. But it feels innovative and fresh and I don't know, just different. It sort of shames the very simple flip a card and see what happens a way of doing automas with a deck of cards. But with that comes added complexity.
Right. And I guess for me, thinking about like all of the rules and procedures for it, I think I would have to be playing pretty consistent games consecutively in order to get familiar with those rules. I think even if I was playing this game to, however many different games, if it was spread out enough, I think it would be enough time to where I'm always kind of having to go back and look at the rules to like make sure like with confidence that I'm doing, things right.
Yeah, I think that's true. And for me, I don't get to play the same game enough times in a row to be doing that, I guess. I'll revisit a game, 5 or 6 times in one go, max, before I put it away, and then I don't revisit it for a year, say. When I revisited this game, I would have to relearn all of this.
Right. It's like you remember most of it, but it's just having that level of confidence, I feel like, for me personally.
Yeah, and the confidence that says, I know this game well enough that it's actually going to be a compelling solo experience. Because the thing is, with solo games rules, you can't really just fudge it.
Right.
If you don't have all that stuff in your head, you lose some of the main things that make it challenging. So that leads us, I think, right into the good, the bad, and the ugly for this game, which is how we evaluate all the games we cover on this show. And for me, I think there's a lot to really like about this game.
Yeah. It has so much depth. I would say an insane amount of replayability.
Yeah, absolutely. Between the different combination of cards that can come up in the AI deck, all the different powers that are in here with the different spirits you could play, the different ways you can build their decks, it is crazy.
Yeah, how you can start them off, and if you really were ambitious and you wanted to control 2 spirits at the same time, which is an option, then that's just more knobs to turn as far as like which spirits you pair together and how you have them working in concert together.
Yeah, and there's an expansion available for this game also that was included with the Kickstarter that we didn't look at.
Oh, okay.
It has even more spirits out there, which, it's just so cool. That amount of replayability is awesome. Plus, the game just looks gorgeous. It's a beautiful looking game. We've said on this show before, and for me, it's definitely true. When a game is beautiful, it makes me want to get it out and play with it. That definitely does it for me. So, in most of the component choices here, make this a positive experience for me. I would definitely put that in the good category. I love playing with those big cards, even though they take up a lot of space. Everything looks great on the table. Love all of that. As a side note, for people who are wondering, we have the retail version of this game where the spirits come in little standees. There was a deluxe version offered on the Kickstarter that you can maybe buy the pieces for on the Mindclash website now that add miniatures for each of these. I know during the Kickstarter they had the option for them to be pre-painted.
Oh, okay.
And that's amazingly well pre-painted.
Yeah.
So they're beautiful miniatures from what I can tell. But I can tell you from having the standees, they look really nice too.
Right. They're nice, big cardboard cutouts with the image of your spirit on it.
Yeah, that show off that artwork some more. So those all look good too. So great components for this game. I would say too that I like the feeling of invoking and empowering the emotions. Even though it basically comes down to putting a card on the table, the abilities that are tied to it that you can sort of stack over the course of the game are pretty cool. And the feeling of upgrading one of those emotions to a strong emotion feels neat to me. It just feels like good progression that coincides well with the kind of progression that you see in your character.
Right, yeah, and kind of modifying your abilities and whatnot. I really like the little centerpiece of the mind that's rotating around with the pools of willpower that you can use your absorption ability on, and just how that ties in together with like where your spirit is positioned, what bonuses you get from that, how it affects the progression of scoring and all that. It's just a really neat part of the game that I like. Probably my favorite part of the game.
Yeah, I really like that too. That sort of timing puzzle that it presents with the fortresses and with the different abilities that you might get from absorbing from one of those little spots over another. When is the right time to empty those to start a revelation? That's all so cool and really an unexpected part of this game for me. I went in expecting just area control, and most of the game is that. But that little puzzle is a very neat add-on that feels like a natural part of it. Not something tacked on.
Right.
So all that is great. Just tons of variability. And I would say the solo system is very clever here. And I do like that about this game. That it does a lot with very little in terms of how it uses the deck of cards. I find that to be a fascinating system.
I think the core of it's good. All of the rules associated with it, I don't love. But I think just the core concept of pairing the cards together and how that dictates it and what you get to see coming up, I think that is all well thought out.
Yeah, actually that leads perfectly into the bad section for this game, because I would say as well that even though I do love that core cleverness that exists in the solo variant, the rules are a problem for me. There are just too many of them for a solo experience for my taste. And I revisit games, once a year for 4 or 5 games in a row. I just don't want to have to go through this much every time to relearn it and re-prepare myself. It's cool that he's managed to accomplish this, but for me, that coolness doesn't outweigh the just practicality of how I'm going to take time to set aside, reading rules and setting it all up, which is, again, a bear. And even more so if you haven't played it in a while and don't remember. It's just sometimes overly complex.
Yes.
And not in a way that draws me in either, which brings us to another thing that I would consider bad for this game. This game has a very cool theme. I love the concept of this fantasized mind world that you're building. I love the idea of building the personality of a person, but because it is a fantasy version of sort of a real life phenomenon, you are one step removed, in a sense, from what's happening. And that, combined with all the rules overhead, means that I never feel quite immersed in what's happening thematically in this game. I don't feel like a spirit who's influencing different areas of the brain. I feel like I'm playing an area control game with a cool theme sort of laid over top of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I'm not, like I've kind of said before, area control is not my thing. And so thinking in terms of how to try to accomplish things in area control is already going to kind of pull me out, I know, to some degree. But the entire time I'm playing the game, I just see it's a conceptual game or an abstract game for me. This is where I have power. These are like threat areas. I'm never thinking like, oh, well, if I can put, excitement in the willow of whatever emotional area that it is or part of the brain. Like none of that ever really stuck. I didn't feel like I was encompassing the spirit that I was playing as. Yeah, I don't know. It was hard. And all of the terms that were used to kind of theme everything also. I feel like they're a part of kind of like an internal logic of the game. And so it's just easy for me to disconnect from them.
In one sense, it feels like an abstract game because you're playing a game about abstract concepts.
Right.
You're trying to find some way to ground and make tangible these ideas of emotions. And so they're embodied, and they're trying to do things that build a big obelisk in the world. And I understand the difficulty of trying to make a theme about abstraction feel more concrete in a way that sucks you in. For me, it just felt like I was just kept out of it all the time. And one of the problems you mentioned was the language.
Mm-hmm.
The constant use of thematic language that doesn't actually mean anything in game in a way that ties me to the mechanic that it's associated with is a real barrier for me. So for instance, you need to collect these different kinds of tiles to upgrade your character. You were mentioning this just before we recorded. They're called vibe tokens.
Right.
They're just tokens.
Right.
They're just tokens that you need a different kind of shape on them to put them on your board. Calling them a vibe token actually pushes me away when it's supposed to be trying to draw me in a little bit more of the theme. I think they're trying to use thematic language in a way that tells you, hey, every corner of this is just shot through a theme. And you can see that they made that effort, but it doesn't feel like it as a play experience.
Right. I would say in the beginning, it just added confusion because I never knew what they were really referencing. Or I'm like, is that what this is? And I would always have to kind of double check to make sure I was, doing the right thing because it all kind of seemed arbitrary in that sense.
Yeah. And neither of us have ugly things to say about this game.
Right.
But for me, these negative things, the disconnection with the theme, the just overhead that's involved in the rules here, these keep this from being a game that I love in the same way that I love Anachrony, and instead just make it a game that I like.
Yeah.
I think it's a well-made game. I enjoyed my time with it for the most part. I think that there are a lot of interesting things at work here, but I just wanted to be drawn in a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that you like this game a little more than me, but that all being said, there's things about the game that I don't love, but I don't think it's a bad game by any measure. I think some of other Mind Clashes games I really like a lot more, and they work for me a lot better. But I'm gonna have a hard time getting into an area control game, period. And then just some of the other things that we talked about with how solo works and just the theme. I was never really able to connect with it. That keeps me from ever loving this game. It's a game, if people wanted to play, I would play with them, and it would be fine. But just don't love it.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. And so, even though I think this is a good title, I think if you're interested in trying out an area control game for solo play, this will probably be unlike anything in your solo collection, would be my guess. And I've not played this multiplayer, but I would also guess that if you ever do play multiplayer, it would be unlike anything else you have simply because of that team aspect that I don't think I've ever seen in a Euro game before.
Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Yeah, so, I mean, this has the potential to be something truly unique in your collection. It's not for me, but it may be for you. And that's sort of where I land with this one. This doesn't get the stamp of approval, but it's a solid game.
Yeah.
And that seems like as good a place as any to end. So that's all we've got for you for this episode. If you didn't know, the Solosaurus podcast is part of a larger network of shows called the Dice Tower Network. And if you like this show and you want to find other shows about board games, you can go to dicetower.com and learn more about the other shows in the network and find your next, second favorite podcast after this one. You can never like another podcast more than this one. Also, you can like us on Facebook. We have a great Facebook page where we post pictures sometimes about stuff we're playing if we're not too busy with work and other stuff. You can follow us on there and see what we've just got in or what we're reviewing. You can do the same thing with us on Instagram, where you can find us at Solosaurus Podcast. If you have a question that you want to send to us, you can send it to us at solosauruspodcast@gmail.com. And finally, if you haven't already, please go rate us or review us on iTunes. It's a small thing for you, but it's a big thing for us. It helps other people to find the show and get other people to explore the exciting world of solo games. And that's all we've got for you this time. My name is Brandon Waite.
And my name is Carter Mackey.
And this is Solosaurus.